You think you know a story about a broken man and a lonely woman? You think you know how it goes, but you have no idea what was really happening on that dusty auction block the day a ghost was sold for $1. He hadn't been seen in 20 years. Not really. They called him the Mountain Man, but the old-timers, the ones with fear in their eyes, they called him something else. They called him the Ghost of the Ridge, a man who walked out of a massacre and into the trees and never came back. His name was Jonah Bell, and most folks thought he was long dead. Then one morning, there he was, cuffed, silent, standing on the auction block like a piece of livestock. His eyes were flat, like two stones at the bottom of a cold river. He wasn't being sold for debt. That was just the story they told. He was being sold because the powerful men in this territory wanted him gone, and this was quieter than a bullet. It was a warning. No one dared bid. Not for him. Owning Jonah Bell was like owning a lit stick of dynamite. Then she stepped forward, a pregnant widow with two small children hiding behind her worn dress. Her name was Clara Mae Dillard, and she looked like a strong wind would blow her right over. She wasn't looking for a husband. She wasn't looking for help. She was looking for a signature on a piece of paper, any signature, to satisfy a legal clause that said she couldn't hold her late husband's ranch alone. It was a formality, a loophole she had to close before the bank took everything. The auctioneer, a fat man sweating in the morning sun, looked at her like she was crazy. "What's your bid, ma'am?" She held her head high, her voice barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. $1. A few men snickered, but no one else bid. The gavel fell. It was done. They handed her a piece of paper that said she now owned Jonah Bell, body and soul. The sheriff unlocked his cuffs, and the metal fell to the dust with a soft thud. For the first time, the Mountain Man lifted his head. He didn't look at the sheriff, or the crowd, or the sky. He looked straight at her. His eyes weren't empty anymore. They were burning. He took a step toward her, and the crowd flinched back. He leaned in close, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that was meant for her and her alone. And he didn't say her name. He didn't say, "Thank you." He said, "They're coming for the deed, Clara. He knows you have it." Clara froze, her blood turning to ice. The town knew her as Mrs. Dillard. No one had called her Clara since she was a girl. And the deed was just a piece of paper for a worthless, broken-down ranch. Wasn't it? How did this man know her name? And what in God's name was on that deed that someone was willing to kill for? She had just bought a man to save her ranch, but she was quickly realizing she hadn't saved herself. She had just invited the monster in. The wagon ride back to the homestead was the quietest kind of loud. Every creak of the wheels, every gust of wind sounded like a gunshot waiting to happen. Her son, Evan, who was 8 years old and trying his best to be the man of the house, stared at Jonah with wide, suspicious eyes. Her daughter, Noli, just 6, hid her face in a threadbare doll, sensing the tension coiling in the air. Jonah sat in the back, silent as a stone, his gaze sweeping across the horizon. He wasn't looking at the scenery. He was watching, scanning, like a wolf expecting an attack from every direction. Clara's hands trembled on the reins. "How do you know my name?" she asked, her voice tight. He didn't look at her. He just kept watching the trees, the rocks, the shadows. "I know a lot of things," he said, his voice still a low rumble. "I knew your husband, David." That hit her like a physical blow. David, her sweet, kind David, who had died in a supposed hunting accident just 6 months ago. The official story was that his rifle misfired, but Clara always felt a sliver of doubt, a cold spot in her gut that told her something was wrong. "You knew David?" "We were partners," Jonah said. The words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. "Partners in something that got him killed." Clara pulled the wagon to a sudden jarring halt. The mule brayed in protest. She turned, her face pale. "What are you talking about? He was a rancher. We were building a life." "He was," Jonah agreed, his eyes finally meeting hers. And in them she saw a terrible, ancient sadness. "But he found something up in those hills. Something that wasn't his to find. Something that men like Silas Blackwood would burn the world down to possess." Silas Blackwood. The name was poison in this territory. A man who owned the mines, the bank, the sheriff, a man who moved like a shadow and left ruin in his wake. People whispered he was more demon than man. David would never get involved with a man like that, she whispered, shaking her head. It was a lie, and she knew it. David had been desperate. The ranch was failing. He had been gone for weeks at a time, coming back with dirt under his nails and a haunted look in his eyes. He didn't have a choice, Jonah said. And neither do you. Silas thinks the map is on your deed. That's why the bank is suddenly trying to foreclose. That's why you needed a man's signature. It's all Silas, pulling the strings. Suddenly, it all clicked into place. The legal notices, the sudden pressure. It wasn't random. It was targeted. Before she could process it, Jonah went rigid. "Get down," he hissed. He moved with a speed that was terrifying for a man his size. In one fluid motion, he was off the wagon, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from a hidden sheath in his boot. He lunged toward the side of the trail, into a thicket of bushes. There was a grunt, a sharp cry that was cut short, and then silence. Evan gasped. Noli started to cry. Jonah emerged from the bushes, wiping his blade clean on the grass. He didn't look triumphant. He looked weary. "Just a scout," he said, his voice flat. "Sent to see if you were alone. There will be more." Clara stared at him, at the blood on the grass, at the cold efficiency of his movements. The man she'd bought for $1 wasn't a drifter. He wasn't a laborer. He was a killer. And he was the only thing standing between her children and the richest, most ruthless man in the West. She picked up the reins, her knuckles white. "Get in the wagon," she said, her voice shaking but firm. This wasn't about a ranch anymore. This was about survival, and she had just thrown her lot in with a ghost who knew how to make other men disappear. The homestead wasn't much. A crooked cabin that leaned like a tired old man, a barn with more holes than wood, and a fence that was mostly suggestion. To Clara, it had been a sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap. As soon as they arrived, Jonah began to move with a quiet, unnerving purpose. He wasn't looking for chores. He was assessing a battlefield. "The windows are too big," he said, running a hand over the flimsy frames. "The door won't hold. Where's your well?" He spoke in clipped, practical terms. Clara, still shaken, simply pointed. He strode over to it, peered inside, then began walking the perimeter of the small property, his eyes missing nothing. Evan followed him at a distance, a mix of fear and fascination on his young face. Clara took the children inside, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The whole world had tilted on its axis in the span of a few hours. Her husband wasn't just a rancher. He had a secret partner. He hadn't died in an accident. He was murdered. And the scrap of paper that gave her ownership of this land was actually a map to a treasure she never knew existed. That night the air grew cold. Clara made a thin stew and they ate in silence. Jonah took his bowl and sat by the door, his back to the wall, watching the darkness outside. He looked less like a guest and more like a guard dog. After she put the children to bed in the small loft, Clara finally found her courage. She sat down at the table, across the small room from him. "You said you were his partner," she began. "Tell me everything." Jonah didn't look at her for a long time. He just stared into the fire she'd built in the hearth, the flames dancing in his stony eyes. "David was a good man," he said finally. "Too good for what we found. We were prospecting, just trying to make enough to get by. Then we found it. A seam of gold so rich it would make a king blush, in Blackwood's territory." He paused, the weight of the memory pressing down on him. "We knew we couldn't move it ourselves. We needed a third partner, someone with influence to launder it, to make it clean. We made a mistake, a bad one. We brought in Silas Blackwood." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What did he do?" "What he always does," Jonah said, his voice laced with venom. "He wanted it all. He set a trap for us. I was supposed to be at the meeting point. David went in my place. Silas's men were waiting. They took David. And they told the world he had a hunting accident. They framed me for a train robbery that happened 100 miles away. I've been rotting in a federal prison for the last 6 months. But the auction," Clara stammered. "They said you had debts." "Silas arranged it," he said grimly. "He pulled strings, Had me declared an indentured debtor. He wanted me out of prison, but under his control. He was going to buy me himself quietly. Have his men convince me to tell him where the mine is. He never in a million years expected a woman with 2 kids to bid $1. It was a staggering story, a tale of gold, betrayal, and murder. And she was standing right in the middle of it. "So the map," she started. "It's really on the deed?" Jonah finally turned to look at her, and his expression was grim. "No," he said softly. "That's the part Silas doesn't know. The part that's kept you alive this long. David was clever. He knew Silas would come for the deed. He made it a decoy." Clara's mind raced. If it wasn't on the deed, then where was it? Jonah stood up. He walked over to the stone hearth, the very heart of the small cabin. He knelt down and ran his rough fingers over the large flat stone at the base. "David was a stonemason before he was a rancher," he said. "He knew how to hide things in plain sight." He pressed a specific spot on the edge of the stone. With a low grinding sound, a section of the rock shifted, revealing a hidden, shallow compartment beneath. Clara gasped. Inside wasn't a map on paper. It wasn't a box of gold. It was a ledger and a single heavy pistol. David's pistol. "The ledger," Jonah said, his voice barely a whisper, "is Blackwood's entire criminal enterprise. Names, dates, shipments, bribes, everything. It's the only thing he's afraid of. The gold is just money. This," he tapped the book, "this is his life." Clara stared at the book, then at the gun lying beside it. David hadn't just left her a map. He'd left her a choice. Run and hide or stay and fight. Before she could speak, a sound from outside shattered the silence. The low, mournful howl of a dog, followed by a second one, and a third. Jonah was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the pistol from the hearth. "They're not dogs," he said, his voice deadly calm as he strode to the window, peering into the blackness. "They're signals. The first scout didn't report back, so they sent the whole pack." He looked back at her, his face a mask of cold fury. "Bar the door. Keep the children away from the windows." The sanctuary had officially become a fortress, and the siege was about to begin. The world outside their small cabin exploded into chaos. The first shot shattered the night, punching a hole through the front window and burying itself in the far wall, just inches from where Noli's doll lay. Clara screamed, snatching the children from the loft and shoving them under the heavy wooden table. Evan was pale but silent, his eyes fixed on Jonah. Noli was sobbing into her mother's dress. Jonah didn't flinch. He was a creature of the dark, moving with a fluid grace that defied his size. He blew out the single lamp, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, illuminated only by the faint glow from the hearth's embers and the slivers of moonlight piercing the walls. "How many?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling as she loaded David's old hunting rifle, her hands moving on pure instinct. "At least 5, Jonah replied from the far window. "Maybe more. They're trying to draw us out." Another shot rang out, this one splintering the doorframe. Clara could hear rough voices shouting outside, calling Jonah's name, taunting him. They were Silas Blackwood's men, hounds sent to retrieve their master's property, the ledger. "Belle, we know you're in there. Blackwood just wants his book. Send it out, and we'll let the woman and her kids walk." The voice was oily, confident. Jonah let out a short, humorless laugh. "He's lying," he said to Clara. "They won't leave witnesses." He peered through a crack in the wall, his new pistol held steady. He was waiting, patient, a spider in its web. Clara watched him, her fear warring with a strange sense of awe. This man was not just a survivor, he was a predator. He had let himself be captured, sold, brought here, all for this moment. This was his plan all along. The men outside grew impatient. They began firing at the cabin in a volley, the wood groaning under the assault. Splinters flew through the air. Clara shielded her children with her own body, praying the flimsy walls would hold. Then in a lull, Jonah acted. A shadow moved near the barn. He didn't fire a warning shot. He didn't shout. There was a single deafening boom from his pistol, a scream from the darkness, and then silence from that direction. One down. The men outside erupted in angry yells. Their shooting became wilder, more frantic. They weren't dealing with a cornered rancher. They were dealing with the ghost of the ridge. "Stay here," Jonah commanded, his voice low. He began to move toward the back of the cabin, where a small root cellar door was set into the floor. "There's another way out. David and I planned for this." He was going out there, into the night, to hunt them. Clara's blood ran cold. "You can't," she pleaded. "They'll kill you." He paused at the cellar door and looked back at her. In the dim light, she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen before. Not anger, not vengeance. A flicker of something that looked like regret. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice dropping so low she could barely hear him. "About David. About why Silas was able to capture him so easily." She held her breath. What else could there be? "David wasn't just betrayed by Silas," Jonah said, the words like stones. "He was betrayed by someone else first, someone he trusted. That's how Silas found him. That's how Silas knew to come after you." Her mind reeled. Another betrayal? Who? Who else knew? "The man who brought you the news of David's accident," Jonah continued, his eyes boring into hers. "The man who offered his condolences. The friendly neighbor who checked in on you. The one who told you about the legal clause forcing you to get a man's signature." Clara's world fractured. She saw the face in her mind. A kind face. A trusted face. The man who owned the next ranch over. The man who had been her husband's closest friend. Mr. Abernathy, it was him. He had been playing her all along. He had orchestrated the entire thing, steering her toward the auction, making sure she was desperate enough to buy a man. Any man to secure her deed. He was one of them. "He's out there now," Jonah said, his hand on the cellar door. "Leading them. He knows this land as well as I do." The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that for a moment Clara couldn't breathe. Her friend, her neighbor. He had smiled at her, brought her food, patted her children's heads, all while leading wolves to her door. Jonah lifted the cellar door. "Bar the main door behind me. Don't open it for anyone but me and Clara." He paused, his gaze intense. "If I don't come back by sunrise, burn the book. Don't let him get it. Promise me." He slipped into the darkness of the cellar without waiting for an answer, closing the door behind him. She was alone. With her children, a rifle she barely knew how to use, and a secret that could bring down the most powerful man in the territory. And a pack of killers, led by a man she once called a friend, was trying to tear her world apart from the outside in. The silence that followed Jonah's departure was worse than the gunfire. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of dread. Clara's ears strained, trying to parse every rustle of leaves, every creak of the cabin's old bones. Were those footsteps? Was that a whisper? Her imagination painted monsters in every shadow. She dragged a heavy chest in front of the main door, her body trembling with adrenaline. Evan, seeing her fear, stood up from under the table. He grabbed the small wood axe from beside the hearth. It was far too big for him, but he held it with a grim determination that broke his mother's heart. "I'll help, Mama," he said, his voice a squeak, but his eyes were steady. "Stay with your sister," Clara ordered, her voice softer than she intended. She couldn't afford to be soft right now. The minutes stretched into an eternity. Where was Jonah? Had they found him? Had Abernathy's knowledge of the land given them the edge? The thought was a cold spike of terror. She had pinned all her hopes on a ghost, a man she'd known for less than a day. Then a new sound. Not a gunshot. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At the back window. Tap, 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 tap. It was a code. It had to be Jonah. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her knees weak. She crept to the window, rifle raised. Through the grimy glass, she saw his silhouette. She cautiously unlatched it. "It's done," he whispered, climbing inside. He was unhurt, but there was a fresh spatter of blood on his cheek that wasn't his. "They're gone." "All of them?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "The hired guns are," he confirmed, "but not Abernathy. He ran as soon as things went south. Coward." He spat the word. "He'll go straight back to Blackwood. This isn't over. We've just bought ourselves a little time." He moved to the hearth, his body showing the first signs of exhaustion. He had been running on pure adrenaline for days. He sank to the floor, leaning his head back against the stones, and closed his eyes. Clara watched him, a storm of emotions churning inside her. He had saved them. He had appeared out of nowhere and thrown himself between her family and a monster. She went to the stove and poured the last of the warm water from the kettle into a bowl, grabbing a clean rag. She knelt beside him. "Here," she said softly. He opened his eyes, surprised. She gently wiped the blood from his cheek. It was an intimate gesture, a moment of startling stillness in the midst of chaos. His skin was rough, weathered, but under her touch he didn't pull away. He simply watched her, his gaze unreadable. "Thank you," she whispered. The words felt inadequate. He just nodded, his throat working. "David, he made me promise," Jonah said, his voice raspy. "If anything happened to him, I was to look after you. Took me 6 months in a prison cell to make good on it. So this wasn't just about a partnership or gold or even justice. It was about a promise, a deathbed vow from one friend to another. The weight of that promise filled the small cabin, making it feel both sacred and doomed." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and Noli's soft breathing from under the table, where she'd finally fallen asleep. The immediate danger had passed, but a larger, more menacing threat loomed. Blackwood now knew the deed was a decoy. He knew Jonah was here. He knew Abernathy had failed. He would not send hired guns next time. Next time, he would come himself. "There's one more thing," Jonah said, his voice so quiet it was almost lost to the fire. "Something I found on one of the men. Something you need to see." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded, crinkled piece of paper. It looked like a telegram. He handed it to her. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The message was short, brutally efficient. "Deed is decoy. Bell is with her. Abort, retrieve the boy instead. He is the key. Deed is decoy. Bell is with her. Abort, retrieve the boy instead. He is the key." Clara read the words once, twice. They didn't make sense. Retrieve the boy? What boy? She looked from the paper to Jonah, her eyes wide with confusion. "What does this mean?" she asked. "What boy?" Jonah's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes were filled with a terrible pity. He didn't look at her. He looked over at the table where 8-year-old Evan was now fast asleep, his small hand still clutching the handle of the wood axe. "It doesn't say boy, Clara," Jonah said, his voice guttural, heavy with a truth he clearly wished he didn't have to deliver. "It says the boy." He finally met her gaze. "Blackwood isn't after the ledger anymore. He's after your son." The words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her son. Evan. Why? It was madness. He was just a child. What could he possibly have to do with any of this? Her protective instincts flared, a raging inferno. She scrambled over to Evan, pulling him into her arms, as if her embrace alone could shield him from this new, incomprehensible threat. "No," she breathed, shaking her head. "It's a trick. A lie. Why would he want Evan?" Jonah looked grim. "I don't know. But Silas Blackwood does nothing without a reason. We have to assume he knows something we don't. Did David ever talk to Evan about the mine? Did he ever show him anything? A map? A landmark?" Clara's mind raced, frantically sifting through memories. David adored his son. They were inseparable. They would go for long walks in the woods. David teaching Evan about the trees, the tracks, the stars. She remembered Evan coming home one day, excited, clutching a strangely shaped rock, saying it was a secret from his papa. At the time, she'd thought it was just a child's game. Now, her blood ran cold. The rock. "Wait," she whispered, her eyes wide. She gently laid the sleeping Evan down and rushed to the small wooden chest where her son kept his treasures. A bird's feather, a few shiny pebbles, and one odd, triangular piece of quartz with a dark vein running through it. She snatched it up. Jonah came to her side. He took the rock from her trembling hand. He turned it over and over, his expression growing darker with every second. "This is it," he breathed. "This isn't just a rock. It's ore, high grade, From the mine. He pointed at the dark vein. And this isn't natural. It's a marking. Look. He traced the vein with his finger. It wasn't random. It was a line with a small X carved into it. It was a map. A simple, crude map, but a map nonetheless. David hadn't hidden the location in the hearth. He hadn't put it on the deed. He had given it to his son, hiding it in the one place no one would ever think to look, a child's pocket. The realization was horrifying. Her son had been carrying the key to a king's fortune, and neither of them had known it. But somehow Blackwood did. Abernathy must have seen it. He must have told Silas. "We can't stay here," Jonah said, his voice urgent. "He won't send a posse next time. He'll send an army. Or worse, he'll be clever. He'll use the law. He owns the sheriff. He can have you declared an unfit mother. He can have the boy taken legally." The threat was insidious, a venom that bypassed walls and guns. He could use the system to steal her son right out from under her. "What do we do?" she cried, clutching the rock. "Where can we go?" "There is only one place," Jonah said, his gaze shifting to the jagged peaks of the mountains visible through the window, silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. "The one place he won't expect us to go. The one place he can't bring an army." He looked back at her, his eyes blazing with a desperate resolve. "We go to the mine." It was a crazy, desperate gamble, to run toward the danger instead of away from it. The mine was the prize, the very thing Blackwood was after. But Jonah was right. It was a fortress of rock and shadow, a labyrinth of tunnels that Jonah knew, and Silas's men did not. It was the only place they might have a chance to make a stand. "Pack what you can carry," Jonah ordered. "Food, water, blankets. We leave in 5 minutes." As Clara frantically stuffed supplies into a canvas sack, a new terrible thought wormed its way into her mind. Jonah. This whole time he had been one step ahead. He knew about the deed, the ledger, Abernathy. Now it seemed he'd known about the rock, too. How much had he been holding back? She stopped packing and turned to face him, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You knew," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "You knew the map wasn't in the hearth. You let me believe it was." Jonah didn't deny it. He simply met her gaze, his own filled with a weary sadness. "I suspected," he admitted. "David was a clever man, but he was also a sentimental one. He would have left the key with what he loved most. I just didn't know how. The ledger in the hearth was your shield. As long as Blackwood thought that was the prize, he'd come at the cabin head on. It kept him predictable. It kept you and the children inside, where I could protect you." His logic was sound, brutally so. He had used the ledger as bait. He had manipulated her, yes, but he had done it to keep her safe. It was a cold comfort. "And now?" she asked. "Now the game has changed," he said. "He's not after an object anymore. He's after a person, your son, and there's nothing in this world more unpredictable than a man like Silas hunting a child." A rooster crowed outside, heralding a dawn she wasn't sure they'd survive to see. The time for questions was over. The time for running had begun. She woke Evan and Noli, her heart aching as she explained they were going on a trip, an adventure into the mountains. She saw the fear in Evan's eyes, but he nodded bravely, clutching her hand. They slipped out the back of the cabin, melting into the gray, misty woods as the first rays of sunlight touched the valley floor. The homestead, the place she had fought so hard to keep, was now nothing more than a ghost behind them. They hadn't been walking for an hour when they heard it, the distant sound of horses, a lot of them, moving fast. Jonah pulled them into a deep ravine, pressing them flat against the cold, damp earth. He peered over the edge. Clara crawled up beside him. Below, on the trail leading to her cabin, a dozen men on horseback thundered past. At their head was the sheriff, looking grim, and beside him, riding a magnificent black stallion, was a man in a fine black coat. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, but his face was cold and cruel, his eyes like chips of obsidian. It was Silas Blackwood. He wasn't just a name anymore. He was here, and he had brought the law with him. They watched as the posse surrounded the cabin. Blackwood dismounted, striding to the front door as if he owned it. He found it barred. With a flick of his wrist, He motioned to his men. They used a log as a battering ram, smashing the door off its hinges. Blackwood stormed inside. A few moments later he emerged, his face a mask of incandescent fury. She was gone. The children were gone. Jonah Bell was gone. He held up the ledger they had left behind on the table. He showed it to the sheriff, then, in a gesture of pure contempt, he threw it into the dirt. It wasn't what he wanted, not anymore. Blackwood turned his cold gaze directly toward the mountains. It was impossible, but Clara felt as if he were staring right at her, right through her. He knew. He knew where they were going. He barked an order. The posse split. Half would follow the mountain path. The other half, led by Blackwood himself, would circle around, cutting off the pass. They were being corralled, hunted, and as Blackwood mounted his horse, another rider emerged from the trees to join him. A familiar, stooped figure on a sway-backed mare. Mr. Abernathy. Her former friend pointed a trembling finger up the trail, directly at their hiding spot. He must have seen them leave. He'd been watching the whole time. There was nowhere left to run. The trap was closing. The climb into the mountains was a brutal, desperate scramble. Jonah moved with the certainty of a mountain goat, finding paths that weren't there, pulling the children up steep, rocky inclines. Clara's lungs burned, her legs ached, but she refused to slow down. Every sound behind them was the thunder of hooves, every shadow a phantom rider. Evan was quiet, his small face etched with a terror he was trying hard to hide. He understood now that this was not an adventure. He understood that the rock in his pocket was the reason men with guns were hunting his family. The weight of that knowledge was a terrible burden for a child to carry. They reached a narrow ledge overlooking a deep canyon. The wind howled, whipping at their clothes. "We have to cross here," Jonah yelled over the gale. "It's the only way. Blackwood will have the main pass blocked by now." The crossing was a single massive pine tree that had fallen across the chasm years ago. Its surface was slick with moss and morning dew. Below, a fall meant certain death on the jagged rocks. Noli began to cry, clinging to Clara. "I can't, Mama." "I'll take her," Jonah said without hesitation. He scooped the little girl into his powerful arms. "Don't look down," he told her softly. "Just look at me." He started across the log bridge, his feet sure and steady. Clara took Evan's hand. "We're right behind him, sweetie, one step at a time." Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs as she followed, her eyes fixed on Jonah's back. Halfway across, a shot rang out, the bullet splintering the wood just inches from her foot. They had been spotted. She looked back. On the ridge they just left, Abernathy stood with two of Blackwood's men. He had a rifle to his shoulder. He was trying to pin them down. "Go!" Jonah roared, already reaching the other side. "Move, Clara!" She shoved Evan forward, practically throwing him the last few feet into Jonah's waiting arms. As she scrambled to follow, another shot hit the log. It shuddered violently. A huge crack appeared in the ancient wood. With a groan that seemed to shake the very mountain, the log bridge began to give way. Clara screamed as the chasm opened up beneath her. She was going to fall. In a flash, Jonah was there. He lunged back onto the crumbling bridge, grabbing her arm with bone-jarring strength. He hauled her onto the solid ledge just as the entire tree plunged into the canyon below with a deafening crash. They were safe, but they were trapped. There was no going back. Abernathy and his men were stuck on the other side, shrieking with fury. But they knew the layout of this land. They would find another way around, and Blackwood was still coming from the other direction. They were on a literal island in the sky, with enemies closing in from all sides. "The mine entrance is close," Jonah said, breathing heavily. "A quarter mile straight up." They pressed on, the terrain growing even more treacherous. Finally, hidden behind a waterfall, Jonah pulled aside a curtain of thick ivy to reveal a dark, gaping hole in the mountainside, the entrance to the mine. The air that billowed out was cold and smelled of damp earth and forgotten things. It felt like the mouth of a tomb. But it was their only hope. They plunged into the darkness, Jonah lighting a small lantern he'd carried in his pack. The tunnel was narrow and claustrophobic. Water dripped from the ceiling, and strange mineral veins glittered in the lantern light. After a few hundred feet, the tunnel opened into a large cavern. In the center was a small abandoned camp. A rusted pickaxe, a bedroll, a cold fire pit. David's last hiding place. We'll be safe here for a little while, Jonah said. He'll never find this entrance. But as he spoke, Evan, who had been looking around the cavern with a strange familiarity, let out a small gasp. He pointed toward a narrow, dark fissure on the far side of the cavern. Papa's secret door, the boy whispered. Jonah and Clara stared at him. What are you talking about, Evan? Clara asked gently. Papa brought me here once, Evan said, his voice trembling. He told me not to tell. He said if bad men ever came, there was another way out. He made me memorize it. Jonah grabbed the lantern and strode toward the fissure. It looked like a dead end, but as he got closer, he saw it. Carved into the rock wall, almost invisible, were a series of small, faint symbols. My God, Jonah breathed. It's not just a second exit. It's a map of the entire system. Tunnels Blackwood knows nothing about. David hadn't just given his son the location of the mine. He had given him the key to its escape. Evan wasn't just a target. He was their guide. Suddenly, a distant shout echoed from the tunnel they'd just come through, followed by another. They found the waterfall entrance, Jonah said grimly, his head snapping up. Abernathy must have known about it. The hunters had followed them into the labyrinth. Jonah's mind worked furiously. Evan, he said, kneeling down to look the boy in the eye. His voice was calm, steady. Can you lead us through? Can you remember the way your papa showed you? Evan looked from the dark, scary tunnel mouth to his mother's terrified face. He was just a boy, being asked to do the impossible. He looked down at the ore map in his hand, then back at Jonah. He took a deep breath and nodded. I think so, he whispered. Papa said, follow the smiling stone. They had no idea what that meant, but they had no choice but to trust him. With a small boy as their guide and a cryptic clue as their compass, they plunged deeper into the mountain's dark heart. The shouts of their pursuers echoed behind them, getting closer. It was a race through the veins of the earth, and the prize was their lives. The tunnels twisted and turned, a confusing maze of black rock and suffocating silence. Jonah held the lantern high, its light casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Every drip of water sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind through the tunnels sounded like a whisper. Evan led them with a strange, somber confidence. He would pause at intersections, close his eyes as if picturing a memory, then point the way. This way, he'd say softly. Papa said the air feels colder here. Clara's anxiety was a physical thing, a tight knot in her chest. She was placing her family's survival in the hands of an 8-year-old's memory. It was insane, but every time she felt a surge of doubt, she would look at Jonah. He watched the boy with a quiet, unwavering trust that calmed her own fears. He didn't question Evan once. Behind them, the voices grew louder. Blackwood's men were splitting up, trying to cut them off. They could hear them shouting to each other, their calls echoing eerily through the subterranean world. What is the smiling stone, Evan? Jonah asked, his voice low as they navigated a particularly narrow passage. I don't know, Evan admitted, his own voice tight with fear. Papa just said I would know it when I saw it. They came to a 3-way fork in the tunnel. It was a dead end. 2 paths sloped downward, while one went straight. Evan stopped, confused. I don't remember this, he stammered, his bravery starting to crumble. The shouts from behind were dangerously close now. They could hear boots scrabbling on loose rock. They were only a minute or two behind them. They were trapped. Think, Evan, Clara urged, trying to keep the panic out of her voice. What did your papa say? He said the smile is always hidden in the dark, Evan whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Jonah held the lantern up, sweeping its beam across the rock walls. It was just rock. Gray, black, glittering with quartz. Nothing that looked like a smile. Hidden in the dark. Jonah muttered, his eyes narrowed in thought. He looked at the lantern in his hand, then back at the wall. An idea, wild and desperate, flickered in his eyes. Clara, hold the children, he said, his voice tense, and trust me. He did the last thing she would have expected. He extinguished the lantern. The darkness was absolute, total, a physical presence that pressed in on them, stealing their breath. Clara clutched her children, her heart hammering. Nolly whimpered in fear. "Be quiet," Jonah hissed. "And look. Look at the wall." Clara stared into the blackness, her eyes struggling to adjust. At first there was nothing. Then slowly, magically, something began to appear on the rock face of the center tunnel. Faint, glowing lines of green and blue. It was phosphorescent moss, invisible in the light, but glowing softly in the absolute dark, and the pattern it formed was unmistakable. It was a crude crescent shape, like a wide, knowing grin, the smiling stone. "He painted it," Jonah breathed in awe. "David painted the path with this stuff." At that moment, they saw the flicker of lanterns from the tunnel behind them. Blackwood's men were rounding the last corner. Jonah quickly relit their own lantern. The glowing smile vanished instantly. He grabbed Evan's hand. "Which way, son?" "Straight," Evan said, his voice filled with newfound confidence. Through the smile. They ran. The tunnel was narrow, forcing them into single file. They could hear the men behind them reach the fork, shouting in confusion. They had lost the trail. The trick had worked. They followed the hidden path for what felt like miles, Evan guiding them from memory, Jonah occasionally dousing the light to check for the next glowing marker. They were getting deeper, higher into the mountain. The air grew thinner, colder. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a massive cathedral-like cavern, and in the center of it, lit by a single shaft of light from a hole in the ceiling far above, was the source of it all. A thick, shimmering vein of pure gold running through a wall of white quartz. It was more beautiful and more terrible than Clara could have ever imagined. It wasn't just a seam, it was a river of gold, frozen in stone. "We made it," Clara breathed, sagging against a wall in relief. But Jonah wasn't looking at the gold. He was looking at the cavern floor. In the dust there were fresh tracks, and a recently extinguished campfire. Someone else was here. Someone had been waiting for them. A voice, smooth as silk and cold as a grave, echoed from the shadows of the cavern. "Welcome, Belle. I was wondering when you'd get here." Silas Blackwood stepped out from behind a massive pillar of rock. He was not alone. Abernathy was with him, looking terrified, and flanking him were two massive men, both holding shotguns. They hadn't followed them through the tunnels. They had used another entrance. They had been waiting the whole time. "And little Evan," Blackwood continued, his cold eyes fixing on the boy. "Thank you for the guidance. My men were getting rather lost." His gaze fell on the rock in Evan's hand. "And thank you for bringing me the key." The trap hadn't been behind them. It had been in front of them all along. Jonah pushed Clara and the children behind him, raising the pistol, but he was outgunned. It was over. "It's the ledger I want, Belle," Blackwood said, taking a step forward. "Give it to me, and I'll let the woman and the girl go. The boy. The boy stays with me. He's my insurance." "You'll kill them all anyway," Jonah snarled. "Yes," Blackwood said with a chilling smile. "But they can die quickly or they can die slowly. The choice is yours. The book for their lives." Suddenly, Clara understood. The ledger. The real one. It wasn't in the cabin. She looked at Jonah, a silent question in her eyes. Jonah gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He didn't have it. So where was it? Then another voice cut through the cavern. A weak, raspy voice from the shadows near Blackwood. "Don't do it, Jonah." A figure stumbled forward, pushed by one of the guards. He was thin, pale, with a ragged beard and clothes that hung off his skeletal frame. But Clara knew his eyes. She knew his face. It was David, her husband, beaten, starved, but alive. "David!" she screamed, starting forward, but Jonah held her back. Blackwood laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Ah, yes, the happy reunion? I've been keeping your husband safe for you, Mrs. Dillard. He's been uncooperative, but now I think he'll see reason." He pressed the barrel of his pistol to David's temple. "The book, Belle, or he dies. Right here, right now. Then the boy, then the girl, and then finally her. I'll make you watch." It was an impossible choice, a nightmare from which there was no waking. Jonah was frozen, his face a canvas of agony. He had come all this way, fulfilled his promise, only to lead them all to their execution. Clara looked at her husband, at her children, at the face of the monster who had torn her life apart. And in that moment, something inside her broke. The fear, the grief, the desperation, it all burned away, leaving behind a core of pure, unadulterated rage. She stepped out from behind Jonah. "You want the ledger, Mr. Blackwood?" she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She reached into the canvas sack she'd been carrying. It didn't hold food. It didn't hold blankets. She pulled out the real ledger, David's ledger. She'd grabbed it from the hearth at the last second, acting on a desperate, inexplicable hunch. "Here it is," she said, holding it up. Blackwood's eyes widened with greedy triumph. "But if you want it," Clara continued, her voice dropping to an icy calm, "you'll have to come and get it." And with a powerful scream of defiance, she threw the book. Not at Blackwood, but into a deep, black chasm at the edge of the cavern, a pit so deep the lantern light couldn't find the bottom. For a single, heart-stopping second, everyone was frozen in shock. Blackwood stared at the chasm, his face contorted in disbelief and fury. That single second was all Jonah needed. He didn't shoot. He charged. He moved like a bolt of lightning, a force of nature unleashed. He slammed into the two shotgun-wielding guards before they could even react, sending them sprawling. Blackwood, recovering, turned his gun from David and fired at Jonah. The shot went wide. David, weak as he was, seized the moment. He drove his elbow back into Abernathy, who shrieked and fell, then lunged at Blackwood, trying to wrestle the gun away. The cavern erupted into a whirlwind of desperate violence. Clara shoved her children toward the cover of the rocks. "Run!" she screamed. Jonah was a berserker. He fought with his hands, his feet, the pistol used as a club. He was no longer a man. He was vengeance personified. He disabled one guard with a brutal blow, then turned on the other. Blackwood threw David off him and raised his pistol again, aiming squarely at Jonah's back. "Jonah, look out!" Clara shrieked. But before Blackwood could pull the trigger, a small figure darted out from the rocks. It was Evan. In his hand, he held the heavy triangular piece of ore. With all his might, he threw it. The rock flew through the air and struck Blackwood's gun hand. The pistol clattered to the floor. Blackwood roared in pain and fury, turning on the small boy. But it was too late. Jonah was on him. The fight between them was not long, but it was savage. It ended with Blackwood on his back, Jonah's hands around his throat, his face a mask of cold, righteous fury. He could have ended it right there. He could have crushed the life out of the man who had destroyed so many lives. But as he looked into Blackwood's terrified eyes, he saw Clara shaking her head. He saw David, struggling to his feet. He saw the two children watching, their faces pale. He let go. Justice wasn't murder. Justice was seeing this man rot. He hauled Blackwood to his feet, binding his hands with a piece of rope from the abandoned camp. The remaining guards surrendered. Abernathy was sobbing in a corner. It was over. David stumbled toward Clara, and they collapsed into each other's arms, a desperate, tearful embrace that spoke of months of fear and pain. Evan and Nolly ran to them, and for a long moment they were just a family, shattered and then, miraculously, impossibly, made whole again in the heart of a mountain of gold. Jonah watched them, standing apart. His promise was fulfilled. His fight was over. He was the ghost again, a silent protector whose work was done. He turned and looked at the river of gold in the wall, the source of all this misery. It held no allure for him. He had what he came for. He had brought his friend home. Weeks later, the dust had settled. Not just the dust of the mine, but the dust of their lives. Silas Blackwood and his men, including a sniveling Abernathy, were in federal custody, awaiting a trial that they would most certainly lose. David's testimony, combined with the recovery of the ledger from the chasm by federal marshals, had sealed his fate. The territory was finally free of his shadow. The ranch was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was peaceful. The crooked cabin felt less like a fortress and more like a home. David, though still thin, was getting his strength back day by day. His reunion with his children was a constant moving tableau of quiet joy. He and Clara would sit on the porch, hands intertwined, often not speaking, just content to be in each other's presence again. And then there was Jonah. He stayed, helping David with the repairs, his movements as silent and efficient as ever. But something had changed. The hardness in his eyes had softened. He would sometimes stop his work to watch Evan teach Noli how to skip stones, and the ghost of a smile would touch his lips. He carved a small, perfect wooden wolf for Noli, a companion for her doll. The four of them, Clara, David, Jonah, and the kids, formed a strange but beautiful new shape. Two partners, a wife, a family forged in fire and darkness. One evening as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jonah brought his horse around, fully saddled. He had a small bedroll tied behind it. Clara came out onto the porch, her heart sinking. David followed her, leaning on the post. "You're leaving," she said. It wasn't a question. Jonah nodded, not meeting her eyes. "My promise is kept," he said, his voice low. "Blackwood is gone. David's home. You're safe." "This is your home too," David said, his own voice thick with emotion. "What we have here, it's yours as much as it is ours. We wouldn't be here without you, partner." "I'm not a man for fences and roofs," Jonah said, finally looking up. "I'm a man of the mountains. It's where I belong." He was the ghost, the protector. He couldn't be tamed. He couldn't be tied down. Just then, Evan and Noli ran out of the cabin. Seeing Jonah's horse, they understood immediately. Noli burst into tears, running to him and wrapping her tiny arms around his leg. "Don't go, Mr. Jonah," she sobbed. Evan just stood there, his lower lip trembling, looking at the man who had walked through fire for him. Jonah looked down at the little girl clinging to him, then at the boy trying so hard to be brave. He looked at David, his brother, and then he looked at Clara. He saw the family he had saved, the family he had, for a fleeting moment, been a part of. He saw everything he had never allowed himself to want. He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, the ghost was gone. In his eyes there was just a man who was tired of being alone. Slowly, deliberately, he reached down and untied the bedroll from his horse. He let it fall to the dust. Then he began to unsaddle the horse. Clara let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. A slow, beautiful smile spread across her face. David clapped a hand on Jonah's shoulder, a silent, powerful gesture of gratitude and brotherhood. The family was not just whole again. It was bigger, stronger. The gold remained in the mountain, a sleeping dragon they had chosen not to wake. They had found a different kind of treasure, one that couldn't be spent, only shared. It was the treasure of a second chance, of a quiet dawn after the longest night. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried under the ground. Sometimes they're standing right on your porch, learning how to stay. If this story made you believe in the power of promises and the strength of a family you choose, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we have so many more stories to tell. Let us know in the comments, what was the twist that shocked you the most? We read every single one. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.